Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about a rather important new case that the Supreme Court has taken up and how it might affect everyone. So stay tuned. The case I'm talking about is Tyler versus Hennepin County, Minnesota. Now, Minnesota is one of 14 states that has laws that permit local governments to seize property for payment of property taxes. Now, in most of the 50 states, if the government comes in and seizes your property, for example, let's say, just to make the numbers easy, you have a house that's worth $10,000 and you owe $1,000 in property taxes and you don't pay it, and the government comes in and it seizes the property and sells it at auction. Most states give you a right to redeem that property. And if they don't give you a right to redeem that property, here's what they do. If they sell your $10,000 property for $1,000, which is what you owe, the $9,000 that is extra is rebated to you. But in Minnesota, if they take a home that is worth $200,000 and they sell it for $50 in tax debt, all of that money escheats to the state. And escheats is a technical word. I'm not saying cheats, I'm saying escheats, which means it goes by default to the government. Now, that does not make a lot of sense. I suppose it is a really wonderful way to force people to pay taxes, but it certainly does not show the milk of human kindness, let's say. So Geraldine Tyler is a 93-year-old woman. She owns a $40,000 condominium in Minnesota. She's behind on her taxes, and so the government forecloses, comes in, sells her $40,000 property, and leaves her with nothing. We'll get into the amounts here in a minute, but suffice it to say, there was a huge disparity between what the government was owed and what the government took. So here are the questions that the petitioners presented to the Supreme Court. Whether taking and selling a home to satisfy a debt to the government and keeping the surplus value as a windfall violates the takings clause. And 2, whether the forfeiture of property worth far more than needed to satisfy a debt, plus interest and penalties and costs, is a fine within the meaning of the Eighth Amendment. Now, those are both very interesting questions. As part of a petition for certiorari, one of the things you have to do is you have to tell the Supreme Court what statutes and constitutional provisions are at issue. And here's what they said. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides in pertinent part, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Those are the constitutional provisions that they say are applicable here, and I believe they have a pretty good point, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But here is how they started the introduction to their case. This case presents important questions concerning the application of the takings and excessive fines clauses to foreclosure actions in which local governments take more private property than necessary to pay a tax debt to the government. In 14 states, statutes permit various agencies to satisfy delinquent property taxes, utility bills, or other debts to governments associated with real property by confiscating all title and any equity the owner has accrued in the subject property, no matter how small the amount of taxes due or how large the amount of equity. That is Talmadge Lincoln versus Williams, a Massachusetts case from 2020. The term equity in this context means the value of the property that exceeds all encumbering debts. And they cite a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1947 there. Now, that seems pretty amazing that in the state of Massachusetts, that if you owe $8 in taxes and don't pay it, you can lose all of the equity in your home and the home itself over an $8 tax debt, but apparently that's what can happen. So here's what the lawyers, the Pacific Legal Foundation, if you're ever looking for an entity to support, they don't sponsor this video, but if you're ever looking for an entity to support with charitable donations, the Pacific Legal Foundation is a good one. They rode to the rescue of Geraldine Tyler here. Here's what they say. The nationwide consequences of this practice are shocking, depriving thousands of vulnerable and often blameless owners of their entire interest in homes and land over debts as small as $8. And they cite a Michigan case there where apparently it was an $8 debt in 2020. The county confiscated a middle-class home as payment for an $8 property tax debt. Individually, the loss for struggling property owners can be devastating. Collectively, they lose millions of dollars in equity every year. Now we're going to get to that point where we talk about how much Tyler owed and what the government took. Here, Tyler owed approximately $2,300 in delinquent property taxes and nearly $12,700 in interest and penalties and costs associated with her debt. The county foreclosed on her home and sold it for $40,000, collecting the debt, all interest and penalties, plus the surplus $25,000 as a windfall. Now, Tyler didn't contest the county's right to foreclose on the property. What she contested was the keeping of the windfall. So here is what the basis of this case is. The 14th Amendment makes the 8th and 5th Amendments applicable to the states through what they call the doctrine of selective incorporation. So, in essence, when a state violates the rights that were initially prescribed for violation by the federal government, it is a violation of the 14th Amendment. This is, or you may recall in Bruin, that was an issue, what the 14th Amendment provided as well as what the Second Amendment provided. So here we get into the issue of what the Takings Clause and the Excessive Fines Clause actually mean. And the Pacific Legal Foundation, on behalf of Mrs. Tyler, said, the Takings Clause or Excessive Fines Clause can and should provide a remedy for Tyler. The county unconstitutionally kept money to which it is not entitled. The moment a tax collector collects what he is owed, his power to take property is exhausted. Thus, the law traditionally imposes a duty on government when collecting taxes or a debt to sell seized property fairly and refund to the former owner any surplus profits after recovering what it is owed and paying any other liens. Now, what that means is that if you owe the bank $100,000 and you owe the county $10,000 and your home is worth $200,000, then the bank gets paid and the county gets paid and you get the rest. Because liens, particularly mortgage liens, do have an estoppel effect on the government keeping all the money. It would appear here that Geraldine Tyler owned the entire property free and clear. So the Fifth Amendment is usually considered to be one of the most important amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And basically, it puts certain limitations on the government. And by the government, we mean both the state government, the county government, the city government, and the federal government. And one of those limitations is you can't take property for public use without compensation. So, for example, when they decide to build a mall and they need 3 acres of your farmland to build that mall, and the developer is able to convince the county to use eminent domain to condemn the land and take it for that public use, the owner of that land has to be justly compensated. Now, there are a lot of contested issues with regard to just compensation, because sometimes people want way more than property is worth, but also sometimes property has been in a family for 5 generations and they're really sort of unwilling to part with it. So you can understand where some of that comes from. But the Fifth Amendment provides that you can't take that property without just compensation. So when you take more than you're owed, I mean, it's essentially theft by the government, and that is the issue that has been raised at the Supreme Court. And then there is the excessive fines clause, because in some instances, even punitive damages can be thought of as excessive fines. In fact, there was a recent Supreme Court case that made that connection. So all of this goes into the question of, does the Supreme Court decide to take this case? Well, as you can see here, they had a number of amicus briefs, and then Hennepin County filed a brief in opposition, and it wasn't accepted. And then they filed a new brief a couple of hours later, and it was accepted. And then Geraldine Tyler, a few days later, filed a reply brief, and they distribute it for conference, which is where all the judges get together and decide what cases they're going to take. And then on January 13th, they granted the petition to review the case. So what does this mean? Well, it means that after going through the local Hennepin County Court, the Federal District Court in Minnesota, and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in St. Louis, after going through all of those appellate processes, she is finally going to get a chance to have her case heard by the 9 justices that really matter in this case. And that's the Supreme Court justices, and we'll see what they say. I know how I would decide this case if I was deciding it. If you would let me know in the comments how you would decide this case based upon the rather clear language of the Fifth Amendment and the Eighth Amendment, let me know. As always, if you would, please take a moment to like and share and subscribe if you haven't already. For those of you who have subscribed, thank you very much for doing that. And for those of you who have commented on the videos, thank you very much for doing that. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm and gets this content out there in front of additional people. Again, I appreciate your watching. Thanks again. Have a marvelous day, and I will catch you on here next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.